Have you ever wondered why good people suffer, why you suffer, even when you're doing everything right? You're not alone. For centuries, believers have wrestled with this question in silence, feeling forgotten, misunderstood, or even punished. But what if I told you? There's a secret hidden in the story of Job, one that could transform how you see your pain, your trials, and even your purpose. This isn't just another biblical story. This is a message for your soul, and very few truly understand it. Until now, stay with me, because what you're about to discover could change your faith forever. Why is it that some of the most faithful people go through the deepest suffering? That question has echoed across centuries, haunting even the strongest believers. The book of Job brings this mystery into sharp focus. Job, a man of unwavering faith, was tested in ways most of us can't begin to imagine. He wasn't suffering because of sin, he was righteous, yet adversity hit him hard. This stirs up the old dilemma. How can a loving God allow such torment for someone who lives with integrity? In many Christian circles, we've heard that suffering is the result of wrongdoing. But Job flips that narrative. He was blameless, yet he endured loss, pain, and rejection. His story challenges shallow theology and forces us to dig deeper into the mystery of pain. Could there be a divine purpose behind every trial? Even when God seems silent, could he be working a redemptive plan far beyond what we can see? Job's suffering wasn't random, it was a spiritual test. A dialogue between God and Satan sets the scene. Satan questions Job's motives, suggesting his faith hinges on prosperity. This introduces a staggering truth. Trials may be permitted by God to reveal the strength of our faith. In this cosmic courtroom, Job becomes a testimony of perseverance, integrity, and trust. His life is the battleground where divine justice and spiritual reward are ultimately revealed. Job's pain exposes the shallowness of transactional faith. The idea that if we're good, God owes us comfort. But faith isn't a trade. It's a trust, even when the blessings vanish. Just as gold is refined in fire, so too our faith is tested through suffering. The trials that feel like punishment may be preparation. They aren't signs of abandonment, but invitations to a deeper relationship with God. If Job had never suffered, we wouldn't know the depth of his righteousness. His trials stripped away all false securities. It's in adversity that faith shows its true face, not in abundance but in ashes. Here we learn a hard yet holy truth. Suffering is not always a sign of God's displeasure. Sometimes it's the very stage on which God's glory is about to be revealed. Consider your own life. Have you walked through seasons of torment, wondering where God was? Maybe you're there right now, in a storm that makes no sense. Job's story doesn't just sympathize, it validates your experience. It whispers hope, you're not alone, and your suffering isn't wasted. There is wisdom and purpose being forged in your pain. The mystery of divine justice remains, but so does hope. And that's where Job's story begins. Not just with suffering, but with faith that refuses to let go. He may not have had all the answers, but he clung to God anyway. And that's where we begin to see a hint of what's to come. Have you ever felt lost, disconnected from who you truly are, unsure of God's plan for your life? The truth is, you are not here by chance. God has a purpose for you, and I want to help you discover it. That's why I created 3 ebooks that will transform your journey with God. Click the link in the pinned comment and start your transformation now. Before the storm, there was peace. Job's life was marked by prosperity, stability, and spiritual depth. He lived in the land of Uz, blessed beyond measure, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and a large household. But beyond the wealth, what truly set Job apart was his character. He feared God, shunned evil, and lived with integrity. Every morning he offered sacrifices, not out of ritual, but out of reverence. He interceded even for his children, just in case they had sinned in their hearts. That's faithfulness in action. Picture a man who had it all, not just material prosperity, but also the peace that comes from walking in trust and obedience to God. Job wasn't a man of pretense. His devotion was quiet, sincere, and deep. His life teaches us that faith isn't confined to a temple. It shows up in the field, in the home, in every detail of life. He made room for God in everything. That kind of consistency is rare, and it shines all the brighter when tested. But prosperity isn't always a guarantee of divine favor, just as adversity isn't always a sign of divine punishment. Still, in Job's case, the blessings he enjoyed were tangible expressions of God's favor. And yet, the book of Job will soon dismantle the illusion that blessing always equals approval, and suffering always equals guilt. This contrast is part of what makes his story so profound. Job's life before the trials reminds us that you can be walking closely with God and still face challenges. His blessings didn't shield him from trials. They simply revealed what was truly in his heart when those blessings were taken away. It's easy to praise God when everything is going right. The real test comes when things begin to fall apart. In a world that often equates wealth with divine favor, Job's story is a necessary recalibration. God does bless, and he delights in our joy, but he is not bound to our expectations. Job's pre-trial life sets the stage for a larger conversation about faith, not just faith that celebrates abundance, but faith that can endure loss. And we're about to see what that looks like when tested. Imagine Job at sunset, surrounded by his children, livestock peacefully grazing, servants bustling with purpose. A picture of peace. But just beyond the horizon, a trial is brewing that will shake the foundations of everything he knows. What happens when such a life is suddenly shattered? That's the question that sets the next movement of Job's journey into motion, when the tempter steps in with a challenge that will change everything. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. In the heavenly realm, a dialogue unfolds that most of us would never imagine. Satan enters the scene, walking among the sons of God, and the Lord himself points to Job with pride. "Have you considered my servant Job?" God asks, not because he's unaware, but because he's about to make a statement to the universe. Satan responds with a chilling accusation. Job only worships God because life is easy. Remove the blessings, and his so-called faith will crumble. Here we encounter one of Scripture's most unsettling truths. Sometimes God allows tests, not because we're weak, but because we're strong. Satan didn't target Job at random. He targeted him because Job was a threat. In that divine courtroom, Job becomes a symbol of trust, a battleground between integrity and accusation. It's not just Job's life on trial, it's the very nature of faith. Is it real when everything falls apart? Satan essentially claims that Job's faith is transactional. Stretch out your hand, he dares God, and he will surely curse you to your face. That challenge echoes through the centuries. How many of us serve God only when things are good? What if the blessings stopped? Would our worship remain? Job's story asks these uncomfortable questions, not to condemn us, but to reveal the power of tested faith. God permits Satan to strike, but places a limit. Only do not lay a hand on his person. This restriction is crucial. It shows us that even when the enemy is allowed to test us, he is always under divine control. There are boundaries. There is purpose. And though we may not see it in the moment, we are not abandoned to chaos. God remains sovereign, even in the storm. It's hard to digest, isn't it, that God would allow suffering to prove the strength of a soul. And yet, this is the framework of divine justice and spiritual reward. Job's faith is about to walk through fire, not because he failed, but because he stood. And through him, we're invited to wrestle with the weighty mystery of pain and divine purpose. Have you ever felt like you were being tested, not just by life, but spiritually, deeply, in a way that shakes your foundations. This moment in Job's story helps us understand that even when the adversary comes with torment and trials, God is still writing a redemptive narrative. There is meaning, even in the madness. And now, with divine permission granted, the enemy sets his plan into motion. What happens next is swift, brutal, and heart-wrenching. It happened fast. In one devastating day, Job's world came crashing down. One messenger after another arrived with terrible news. His oxen and donkeys were stolen, his servants killed, his sheep consumed by fire from heaven, and finally his children, all 10 of them, dead when the house collapsed in a violent wind. It's the kind of day that leaves a soul numb, the kind of grief that knocks the breath out of your body. And yet, Job fell to the ground, not in despair, but in worship. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Those words, uttered in the face of unbearable loss, echo like thunder across time. It's a response that defies logic, fueled not by denial, but by trust. Job didn't pretend it didn't hurt. He tore his robe and shaved his head in mourning, but he didn't curse God. He bowed low in submission and humility, recognizing that everything he had was a gift. Have you ever watched something you loved slip through your fingers? A job, a relationship, a loved one. Sometimes adversity doesn't knock, it breaks down the door. Job's reaction offers us a holy perspective. Loss doesn't always have to lead to bitterness. It can lead to a deeper surrender. That doesn't mean the pain disappears, but it does mean it can become a place of spiritual clarity. In that moment of loss, Job became a witness to the invisible. His pain became a platform. Divine justice didn't explain itself right away, but Job's faith declared something to heaven and earth. God is worthy, even when life isn't. There's something holy about worshiping in the dark. It's a kind of offering that angels marvel at and demons fear. When life is stripped bare, what remains? That's the question Job answers. His riches, his family, his comfort, all gone, but his integrity remained. That's the kind of perseverance that doesn't just survive suffering, it transforms it. Trials became testimonies, pain became a pulpit, and in the ashes of his loss, Job's soul still reached for God. We often imagine that deep faith shields us from tragedy, but Job's story reminds us that sometimes deep faith is why the tragedy comes, not as punishment, but as a proving ground. His loss wasn't meaningless. It was part of a larger, unseen battle, a cosmic test that would ultimately point to divine wisdom and eternal redemption. But the suffering wasn't over. The physical and emotional torment had only just begun. Satan wasn't done testing Job's faith, and the next trial would strike even closer to the bone. As if the loss of his children and possessions weren't enough, Job is struck next in his own body. Painful sores break out from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. He sits in ashes, scraping himself with a shard of pottery, reduced to a shadow of the man he once was. The external torment is now matched by internal agony, physical pain layered over emotional grief. The weight of adversity presses harder. Yet Job doesn't curse God. In moments like these, even the strongest heart can begin to crack. Job's wife, overwhelmed by what she sees, utters the now infamous words, "Curse God and die." To her, death seems a mercy compared to the torment her husband endures. But Job answers with a trembling kind of wisdom, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" His patience isn't passive, it's rooted in trust. He holds on, not because he understands, but because he knows who God is. And then come the friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They sit with Job in silence for 7 days. That silence in itself is profound. For a moment, it seems like true compassion. But when they open their mouths, the comfort ends. They begin to speculate, accuse, theologize. Their words imply that Job must have sinned, that divine judgment is the only reason for such suffering. Their version of theology leaves no room for mystery. How often do we, like Job's friends, try to explain suffering in neat formulas? We look for reasons, for causes, as if pain always fits into boxes we can label. But the book of Job challenges that. Sometimes suffering isn't punishment, it's preparation. Sometimes it's not about guilt, it's about growth. The divine purpose in pain isn't always visible, but that doesn't mean it's absent. Job's friends misread the trial. They see punishment where there is actually a test. They assume divine judgment when the truth is divine purpose. This is why wisdom and humility are essential when walking with someone in pain. Not every trial is a sign of sin. Sometimes it's the exact opposite, evidence of faith that's strong enough to be refined. Imagine Job sitting in the dust, body racked with sores, soul heavy with grief, and surrounded by men who misunderstand him. That scene is as real today as it was then. People suffer deeply and are often met not with empathy, but with judgment. In these moments, the church is called not to explain, but to embody compassion. Job's pain invites us to listen better and speak less. Yet even in the middle of their misjudgment, Job doesn't lose sight of God entirely. He aches, he questions, he laments, but he doesn't let go. And it's this clinging in the dark that prepares the way for the next turning point, a bold, trembling desire for dialogue with the Almighty. What follows in the story of Job is one of the most raw and honest dialogues in all of Scripture. Job begins to speak, his words full of sorrow, confusion, and a burning desire for answers. He doesn't curse God, but he curses the day he was born. This is not blasphemy, it's humanity. Job is wrestling with the mystery of pain and divine justice, just like so many of us do when life stops making sense. And in the middle of his anguish, his friends become accusers. Eliphaz speaks first with the voice of tradition and mysticism. He suggests that suffering is always the result of sin, cloaked in flowery spiritual logic. Bildad follows with harsh theology, insisting that Job's children must have died because they sinned. Zophar, the most severe of the three, essentially tells Job he's lucky God hasn't punished him more. These aren't comforters. They're theologians who have forgotten compassion. Their certainty becomes a weapon. Job pushes back. "I am blameless," he says repeatedly, and he's right. The reader knows what the friends do not. This isn't about sin. Job doesn't pretend to understand everything, but he clings to one truth. He has lived with integrity. That courage to stand firm, even while everything screams otherwise, is a portrait of perseverance in adversity. It's not arrogance, it's trust in the relationship he has with God. Still, the pain of being misunderstood adds another layer to his torment. Have you ever tried to explain your suffering only to be judged, silenced, or dismissed? Job's experience is painfully familiar to anyone who has suffered in silence, while others pontificate from the outside. It's a reminder that empathy matters more than answers. Theological truth must never come at the cost of compassion. In the middle of this storm of words, Job begins to long for something deeper, a divine audience. He wants to plead his case before God himself. Not to demand repayment, but to seek understanding. "Oh, that I knew where I might find him," he cries. It's not rebellion, it's relationship. Job believes that God is just. He just doesn't understand how that justice is being played out. This longing for dialogue is profound. It teaches us that faith doesn't mean silence. You can trust God and still cry out in confusion. The Psalms are full of it. Jesus did it at Gethsemane. True faith doesn't avoid hard questions. It brings them to the throne of grace. That's what Job begins to do. He shifts his eyes from his friends to the Almighty, and so, from the ashes of debate rises a desperate prayer, not for rescue, but for revelation. And just when it seems like God is silent, the whirlwind begins to stir. Then suddenly God speaks. Not in the way Job or his friends expected, not with an explanation or a detailed defense of divine justice. No, the Lord answers out of a whirlwind. His voice thunders with power and purpose. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? It's not sarcasm. It's a revelation. God doesn't shrink himself to fit Job's questions. Instead, he lifts Job's eyes to something greater, the vastness of divine wisdom, the mystery of creation. God walks Job through the wonders of the universe, oceans contained, stars set in motion, wild animals sustained by unseen hands. The message? There is a divine order, even when we can't perceive it. Job had asked for a courtroom. What he got was a classroom of cosmic proportion, and in that lesson, God teaches without condemning. He doesn't belittle Job, he expands his view. This is humility in motion. Job begins to see that God's wisdom isn't just higher, it's holy. Job wasn't wrong to ask questions, but he now realizes how little he truly knows. The problem wasn't his integrity, it was perspective. When we suffer, our view narrows. Pain shrinks the world to what we've lost. God's response reminds us that there's a broader canvas, and he is painting redemption with colors we can't yet see. Think of it like looking at the back of a tapestry. From that angle, it's all tangled threads and chaos, but God sees the front, where every stitch has purpose. That's the invitation he gives Job and us. Not to understand everything, but to trust the one who does. This is what faith looks like in the fire, not full comprehension, but full surrender. Interestingly, God never tells Job why he suffered. Instead, he reveals who he is, and that turns out to be enough. Sometimes we want answers when what we need is awe, not a solution, but a deeper trust. Job is silenced, not because he is shamed, but because he is overwhelmed by the majesty of God. And in that silence, something shifts. Job responds, not with accusation, but repentance. Not for sin that caused suffering, but for the pride that tried to grasp what only God can hold. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, he says, but now my eye sees you. This is worship born not of prosperity, but of revelation. And with that posture of humility, something beautiful begins to unfold. Restoration, redemption, and the turning of sorrow into joy. When Job finally responds to God, his words are soaked in awe, not anger. I repent in dust and ashes, he declares, not because he was guilty of hidden sin, but because he now sees God with new eyes. There's a transformation here, subtle yet profound. His questions haven't all been answered, but his soul has been settled. In the presence of divine wisdom, Job chooses submission. That kind of humility becomes the doorway to restoration. Then comes the astonishing part. God turns his attention to Job's friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, those who had spoken wrongly about God and misrepresented divine justice, are now called out. God doesn't just correct them, he asks Job to intercede for them. Imagine that. The man who had been accused and abandoned is now called to be a priest for the very ones who hurt him. Forgiveness becomes the final test of his faithfulness. Job prays for his friends, and the tide begins to turn. God restores him, not just with what he lost, but with double. Twice the livestock, twice the wealth, even more children. But this isn't prosperity gospel. This is divine grace. Restoration isn't a reward for enduring. It's the fruit of trust and surrender. God gives not just because Job persevered, but because he is good. Always has been. Always will be. It's worth noting that Job's restoration begins after he prays for his friends. Sometimes breakthrough comes not when we focus on our pain, but when we choose compassion in the face of injustice. That's a hard but holy lesson. Healing often begins when we let go of bitterness. In forgiving others, Job's own heart is made whole again. And so the story that began in loss ends in redemption, but not the kind of shallow, surface-level blessing. Job emerges from the ashes with a deeper faith, a fuller knowledge of God, and a renewed sense of purpose. His new family is a testament to divine mercy. His wealth returns, but now it rests on a foundation of humility and awe. Prosperity in this case is no longer the goal. It's a reflection of a heart aligned with God. Have you ever felt like you wouldn't recover from what life took from you? Job's story reminds us that God doesn't just restore what was lost, He redefines it. Restoration is not a return to the past, it's a resurrection. It's grace multiplied after grief. And in Job's case, that restoration didn't erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. But perhaps the greatest gift wasn't the livestock or the wealth, it was the dialogue with God, the deeper understanding, and the peace that surpasses all explanation. And now, as we reach the end of this incredible journey, we must ask, what exactly have we learned from the book of Job? The book of Job is not merely a narrative of suffering, it is a profound theological journey into the heart of divine justice, human pain, and the endurance of faith. One of its core teachings is that the righteous are not exempt from trials. Job, described as blameless and upright, faced unimaginable adversity, not because he failed, but because his faith was worth testing. This truth challenges the simplistic view that suffering is always a result of sin. From Job's journey, we learn that true faith is not transactional. It doesn't say, "I'll serve God if He blesses me." It says, "Though He slay me, yet will I trust Him." This kind of faith doesn't collapse under pressure. It deepens. Job's integrity remained intact, even as his world fell apart. His story shows us that the strength of our faith is revealed not when life is easy, but when everything is stripped away and we still choose to believe. Another vital lesson comes through Job's interactions with his friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, though well-meaning, misapplied truth and added to Job's torment. Their rigid theology couldn't accommodate the mystery of divine purpose. This reminds us that comfort is not found in quick explanations, but in presence, empathy, and grace. When someone suffers, they don't need a theory. They need compassion. God's eventual response to Job teaches us the value of humility before divine wisdom. Rather than offering a detailed reason for Job's suffering, God reveals His majesty through creation, inviting Job and us to trust His eternal perspective. In doing so, Job gains not an answer but an encounter. His view of God expands and his heart is transformed. Sometimes the goal of suffering is not clarity, but communion. One of the most beautiful declarations Job makes is, "I know that my Redeemer lives." In the midst of pain, he speaks of resurrection and redemption. This statement reaches beyond his personal story and points to the broader hope of life after death and eternal justice. Even in the Old Testament, we glimpse the promise of restoration, not just on earth, but in eternity. The restoration Job experiences in the end is not a mere return to what was lost. It is a divine act of grace that underscores God's sovereignty and goodness. Job receives double of all he had before, but more importantly, he receives peace with God, healing in his relationships, and the quiet joy of seeing the hand of the Lord restore what seemed broken beyond repair. Ultimately, the book of Job leaves us with deep theological and practical truths, that God's ways are higher than ours, that integrity in suffering honors the Lord, and that in the mystery of pain, His purpose prevails. It is a call to trust, to endure, and to believe that even when life is hard, our Redeemer lives and is working all things for our eternal good. Now that you've seen the hidden truth behind Job's journey, the real question is, what will you do with it? Will you let your trials shake your faith or shape it? God may not always explain the why, but He always walks with you through the storm. So take the next step, reflect, trust, and live with the kind of faith that endures. Start by reading the book of Job this week with fresh eyes and let God speak to your heart. Share your biggest insight in the comments below. We'd love to hear your voice. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to keep growing in truth and grace with us. If you've ever asked, how do I know when God is truly speaking? What comes next might reveal a gift you didn't even know you had. Let's uncover the 6 powerful signs that God has blessed you with the gift of discernment.